Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm back in Soho again. Such a rich seam of pubs that I thought it deserved a second visit on this wonderfully, gloriously rainy day. I've just been to buy a new umbrella. Pub number one, right on the edge of Soho, just a stone's throw from Piccadilly Circus. It's the St James Tavern. This was formerly known as the Catherine Wheel. The pub's own website suggests a pub on this site since 1733. I was able to find a record of this as a Masonic lodge as far back as 1738. Looking for old newspaper mentions of the Catherine Wheel here on Wimble Street, I found instead quite a lot of mentions of Catherine Wheel Yard. I think Catherine Wheel Yard was probably wiped out in the improvements which created Shaftesbury Avenue in the late 1870s. The earliest clear mention I could find of the pub itself in newspapers was from 1827, when it was sold as part of a large property portfolio. The pub website states that the pub took the name St James Tavern at the time of the 1896 rebuild, but there are newspaper mentions of a St James Tavern on Wimble Street prior to that, including this one in 1889, which clearly gives it at the current address, 46 Windmill Street, back to this one in 1869, at which time it seems to have been a house of ill repute. To add further confusion, there's a newspaper mention of the Catherine Wheel after that in 1871. Not sure what's going on there, but it's clear that the name St James Tavern is older than 1896. There is a sketch from the annual architectural review of 1895 of the building. Presumably that's before it was built, and this sketch does look slightly different from how the exterior of the building looks today. It was built by architect William Brutton, and he also built the Fitzroy Tavern. It does get a brief mention in Pevsner's Guide to Westminster, just quite grand with a turrell. Now, I think that's a turrell rather than a turret because it projects outwards slightly. You can also see the corbelling on the underside of that. There is some granite around the outside, although it hasn't been identified by Ruth Siddall. The pink-coloured granite that was used at the Fitzroy was described as Swedish Balmoral, which apparently was a marketing name for Småland Varmland granite. And I wonder if this may have been the same granite used here as at the Fitzroy Tavern. I also wonder, intriguingly, if that's possibly meant to be a Catherine Wheel up on one of the upper floors of the building. This is in fact the only pub on today's itinerary that is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. They give it just a 1-star rating. There aren't many of the original features remaining, but the most notable ones are, of course, these pictorial tile panels by Daltons of Lambeth. They were founded in 1815 and they became Royal Dalton just a few years after the work done here in 1901. One source I read said that these were possibly painted by an artist called John McLennan for Daltons. The 4 larger panels depict Shakespearean scenes. I think they correspond to Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and As You Like It, and they feature characters Falstaff, Prince Hal, Bardolph and Touchstone. There are 2 further panels that depict hops and grapevines there over the other side of the bar. There's also a little bit of etched glass remaining. It's not really clear how much of that is original. There are some internal columns. They may well be original from that late 1890s build. Composite capitals, partly gilded. So yes, perhaps the rest of the interior a bit more modern and doesn't give you much of a sense of a late Victorian pub. But I think those painted tiles are really quite impressive, and if you're a fan of Daltons, then this is definitely the place for you. It's operated by Stonegate today, who are, I believe, actually currently the largest pubco in the UK. They have more pubs than anyone else, although their branding is usually relatively subtle compared to, say, Greene King, so it's not always obvious that you're in a Stonegate pub. There were just 2 hand pumps on the bar. Sorry, I didn't get a shot of those. It was a bit crowded around that end of the bar. One was serving London Pride and the other was Doom Bar. I just went for a half of London Pride. Pub number 2, the Queen's Head. The Queen's Head is on the corner of Denman Street, which was named for Thomas Denman, 1st Baron Denman, and it was previously known as Queen Street, and it seems like that's probably where the pub takes its name from. It looks to me as though the name of the street changed around 1864. The pub itself, on its sign on the exterior, claims to date to 1738, so we have another 1730s Soho pub, and the earliest newspaper mention I could find for it with the address on Queen Street was 1842. There is a wonderful painting dating to 1855, which you can see a print of on the stairs on the way down to the toilets, which seems to depict what was effectively an early dog show, something like a precursor to Crufts. The landlord at that time was an interesting character called Jemmy Shaw. I believe he was a one-time boxer, and we've definitely seen before boxers gravitating to becoming pub landlords. Jemmy Shaw at the Queen's Head here hosted rat baiting. That was a popular sport in the mid-19th century after other forms of animal baiting were banned. Jemmy Shaw's own dog was the holder of a record of being able to dispatch 100 rats in the space of 6 minutes. The address at the time of those 1850s rat baiting contests was given as Crown Court, Windmill Street, Haymarket, which is slightly different from the address it has today on the end of Denman Street, formerly Queen Street. And it looks as though Crown Court was a few doors up from the current site. Possibly there was an entrance round the back from Crown Court. By the 1920s, the Queen's Head was largely redeveloped to make way for the Piccadilly Theatre, and just this small slither of a pub was left as the Queen's Head itself. Presumably, therefore, was the same architect as that of the Piccadilly Theatre, which was Bertie Crewe, working with Edward A. Stone. It has a sort of rusticated stucco surround of a wide arched frontage. Just a single entrance on the left. I wonder if there may possibly have been a second entrance over to the right-hand side. On the interior, interestingly, some of the woodwork actually looks to me a bit older than that 1920s rebuild, and I wonder if possibly some of the fabric from the earlier version of the pub was somehow retained. The bar back is quite attractive. It has a balustrade along the top and a small pediment and a row of signs displaying the offerings of the pub at that time: wines, spirits, stout, etc. Towards the back of the pub, some more very attractive wood carving around a set of mirrors. There's also a clock above that fixture. Quite a lot of brass in this pub, and the very nice lady behind the bar was busy polishing it all while I was there and kindly let me take this silly bit of footage with the tin of brass. So obviously quite a lot of hard work to keep this pub looking as attractive as it is. There are also a couple of giant chandeliers, which are really too big for the height of the ceiling, but give a nice sense of sort of theatrical excess, which is appropriate given its location. On the ground floor, there is dado height matchboard panelling around the outside walls. There is also quite a different feel to the upstairs room, which I think they use occasionally for sort of private events. That has some full height wood panelling that has a little bit more of a sort of 1920s mock Tudor kind of feel to it. This was actually my first time to come to the Queen's Head, and I was really taken with it as a pub. Has a really cute, compact interior and lovely staff, very friendly and helpful, and answered lots of questions. Very nice atmosphere in here, and definitely a pub I would go back to. Interestingly, it's an independent pub. We are seeing a couple of those on today's itinerary, but that's an increasing rarity in central London and something to be cherished. So I would heartily recommend the Queen's Head. Very nice little pub. Harvey's Sussex Best on tap as well, which was the icing on the cake. Pub number 3, the Lyric, and I'm enjoying the wonderful modern inadequacy of Soho streets for the volume of traffic they have to deal with. Yet again here we have a pub which may have 1730s origins and may possibly at one time have been two pubs which merged together, the Ham and the Windmill, which formed for a time a pub called the Ham and Windmill. Now, this is located on Great Windmill Street, and you can clearly see the windmill after which it is named on Richard Newcourt's map of 1658, but it looks like that had probably gone by the time of William Morgan's map of 1682. It was roughly located where Ham Yard is today, and that obviously has some shared history with the Ham, part of the former incarnation of this pub. The earliest newspaper mention I could find was from January 1803, and that lists Nicholas Danbury, I believe the landlord at the time of the Ham and Windmill, as a witness in the trial of Edward Despard and others for high treason. That suggests that it was probably a meeting place for some of the plotters in the Despard Plot, and indeed the court records do seem to show some soldiers having visited the Ham and Windmill being discussed as part of the trial. The licensing records at the London Metropolitan Archive for this site go back to the 1750s, and really confusingly they seem to alternate year on year between the Windmill and Ham versus just the Ham. I also found a mention from a newspaper in 1766 where it's talking about coaching routes and different stop-off points in London, and curiously, although the name of some of the other coaching inns or coach stops are named for this pub, or possibly some forerunner of this pub, it's just the landlord's name is given, James Rowland of Ham Yard, Windmill Street, but it does seem very much like it was an inn at that time. The current building dates to 1906. It has some mid-grey granite pilasters, possibly from Aberdeenshire at a guess, and they appear to be topped with cartouches. I wonder if they bore a logo at some point in the past. There is a wood bay curved frontage and some etched glass, which is possibly more modern, tiling on the walls to dado height at the entrance and tiled flooring towards the entrance on the exterior as well. There's also a cartouche at the top of the building in the pediment. Wondered if that might have also borne a logo at some point. Couldn't see anything now. On the interior, I can't say I'm really a fan of the paint job, some sort of pale turquoisey kind of colour. There are some thin columns holding up the ceiling, and the ceiling is covered with beer badges showing the vast array of beers that have been served here over the years. It is definitely a drinker's pub, an ale drinker's pub, and there was quite an impressive lineup on the bar, and I think that's usually the case. I think I counted about a dozen hand pumps on the bar. Possibly about 8 of them or 9 were in service at the time of my visit. 1 or 2 of them devoted to cider, but a good selection of things that I actually would be interested in trying. An old favourite there, of course, Harvey's Sussex Best. I actually went for a change for a beer from the Exeter brewery. It's called Ferryman. Not sure it was quite in tip-top shape on this particular occasion. Perhaps I just caught them at a bad time. But the name of that grabbed me because I believe the Exeter brewery used to be known as the Topsham and Exminster brewery, a part of the world where my great-grandfather lived at one time, and he used, I believe, the ferry after which Ferryman was named. There was also a bewildering array of, I believe, 20 keg taps behind the bar, if keg beers are your thing, and I think there are a couple more ciders there as well. Quite an attractive bar back actually there, slightly hidden by all the bottles and taps. It has fluted pilasters with Ionic capitals and a nice frieze along the top. I would guess that dates to the 1906 rebuild of the pub, thereabouts. Pub number 4, the John Snow. Trying to film in Soho is ridiculous. All the vans. I don't think you realise that if you only come here in the evening, but in the daytime it is just one mass of this. I'm in the way. This pub was previously known as the Newcastle on Tyne, or possibly the Newcastle upon Tyne, and the London Metropolitan Archive has licensing records going back to the 1750s. In 1876, I found a newspaper mention of it in its guise as the Newcastle on Tyne, and the landlord, I presume, at the time, was one of the stewards listed for the Licensed Victuallers' School 70th anniversary dinner. Interesting coincidence for me personally. Frederick Seeger Hunt was the guest of honour at that dinner. I actually have one of those Vanity Fair prints of Frederick Seeger Hunt in my living room at home. The address was was previously Cambridge Street, and you can see number 7 Cambridge Street on Hallward's 1799 map. The pub was renamed in honour of John Snow in the 1950s, famous as identifying the source of the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak. There is a nice page on the brewery history website, including a quote from John Snow's own paper on the mode of communication of cholera, dated 1855. There is a brewery on Broad Street near to the pump, and on perceiving that no brewers' men were registered as having died of cholera, I called on Mr. Huggins, the proprietor. The men were allowed a certain quantity of malt liquor, and Mr. Huggins believes they do not drink water at all. The current building dates to 1867. It's a corner pub, and it has 2 blocked up windows at the corner. The ground floor frontage is in wood. There are wood pilasters with diamond-shaped motifs across the frontage. Etched glass windows, probably a bit more modern, but they're nicely done. They have the names of the bar areas within the pub, the saloon bar, the public bar, and the snug. The pub is listed on CAMRA's site for outstanding conversions and renovations. In this case, it's a renovation. They note that the screens have been reinstated by Sam Smith's. They are more modern, I assume, sort of 1990s. It's typically that kind of era that Sam Smith took over these pubs in London. One of those screens has a low door for servicing with a nice bit of etched glass, shaped glass above the doorway. They note that the 3-bay barback and counter could possibly be Victorian, although most of the other fittings are newer, part of that restoration. I think it is a nice recreation of one of those partitioned Victorian pub interiors, possibly with a few original features. Very quiet atmosphere on my visit. It was a weekday afternoon, and perhaps it's a bit livelier in the evening, but I never mind a quiet pub. I'm certainly not complaining. I had the dark mild from Sam Smith's. It does unfortunately come from keg rather than from a hand pump, and as far as I could tell, there weren't actually any hand pumps on offer here. It was all just Sam Smith's keg beers, but if you don't mind them, then it is quite an attractive space with an interesting bit of history. Pub number 5, and there's a big van in the way. The van driver heard me, very kindly moved on, and then immediately another van came up. Brilliant. Take 3. Pub number 5, the Star and Garter. Filming in Soho. Much fun. This is on Poland Street, which was apparently named after a King of Poland inn, which at one time stood at the north end of this street. The building gets a mention in Pevner's Guide to Westminster, citing that it probably dates to the early 1700s, something like 1705 to 1707, although externally appears more 19th century. There are Sun Fire Office insurance records for it going back to 1825, and the earliest newspaper record I could find for the pub are from 1821, the address being slightly different at that time, it being at number 63 Poland Street rather than number 62 as it is today. The building possibly had other uses. Searching for that address, looks like it may have been used as something like a lecture theatre previously in the early 1800s, possibly even an estate agent for a while in the 1810s. So it does seem as though likely the pub only goes back to around about 1820 as a pub, but the building is perhaps 100 years older than that. It has a total of 3 entrances. All of them have brass kick plates, and there are double doors at the centre. There are curved brass signs beneath the 2 windows bearing the name of the pub, Star and on one side and Garter on the other side. It's not on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors, but I do think this is a really charming, unspoilt, old-fashioned kind of pub. It has matchboard panelling to the walls, to the ceiling, and to the bar counter. There's a gantry above the bar counter that is usually festooned with foliage. There is a collection of barrel taps in one part of the pub. One of the internal doors still has saloon bar written on it on a brass plate. I like the ceiling lamps here. I think they're quite a satisfying shape. There is a mirror with the pub's name, a collection of plates, and there are some old prints framed on the wall in various places. I had a delightful time in here at the end of my afternoon out, exploring some of these pubs in Soho. It really felt like a slice of the old Soho. It happened to coincide with Chelsea Cheltenham Festival, and they had some of the racers on the telly there. I don't normally like tellies being on in pubs, but there was something about that evoking Geoffrey Bernard is unwell. He was, of course, an incurable gambler. This is another independent pub, and I think that probably contributes a lot to its charm and the fact that it feels so unspoiled. They had Harvey's Sussex Best Bitter on tap. That seemed to be a running theme in a lot of pubs today, and I'm not complaining. It's an absolute favourite beer of mine. Time to sign off, I think, here from Soho Square. Sorry that some of the audio is done post-production. At least on the plus side, you'll be able to hear me. You don't have a lot of background noise. Might lose a bit of the atmosphere, but I've had a very pleasant afternoon out, actually, exploring some of those slightly lesser known, or perhaps to me slightly lesser known, Soho pubs. Been a lot of fun. Still more that I could have featured, I think, that I've not fit in today. So what a wonderful rich theme of pubs Soho is. What a great part of London. Just, it's so alive still, amazingly, despite all the attempts to make it sort of bland and modern and generic. Somehow just life clings on here. So anyway, thanks very much for watching. See you on the next one.